Hey, what's up? Zach here. And if you've been paying attention to sport recently, really from anywhere around the world, you've probably heard that Rafa Nadal has withdrawn from a few tournaments this summer, and his participation in the US Open is in doubt, all from the result of a foot injury that's been lurking under the surface since he began playing tennis professionally. And you know, me being a foot doctor who cuts court sneakers open on a YouTube channel, I thought I'd be one of the better people to explain Müller-Weiss Syndrome, which is what he's suffering from, to you, because it is such a rare illness, and because the prognosis for it is so all over the place. To be honest, Muller-Weiss is one of those things that the medical community in general doesn't know all that much about relative to other things. And just to give you an example, I've been a doctor for 11 years since I was 23. I've come across Muller-Weiss twice. Now, Muller-Weiss has everything to do with this bone here called the navicular. Now, the navicular bone here is this half-moon-shaped bone that we consider the keystone of the arch, which means it's the most important bone in your arch. It also is where your arch comes to a peak. And really, the navicular is one of the most important bones in your body. It allows your foot to do all those interesting things that you do with it during sports, especially in tennis, with all these pivoting motions, especially sliding on a hard court. Typically, it's the rear part of your foot kind of bending on the navicular, what allows your foot to slide on a hard court or even on clay. And what happens in Muller-Weiss syndrome is where the outside or lateral side of the navicular begins to die, and we call that avascular necrosis, or when the bone literally starts to disintegrate and die. And this disorder has three known causes that we know of. Number one being acute trauma, where you break the bone, you smash it. Number two being excessive force over time, so that means abnormal forces on your foot over a sustained period of time, which is kind of Nadal's style of game in a nutshell. And number three can be a developmental abnormality. When this particular bone doesn't form properly from the time of birth all the way up till 3 years old, sometimes the outside of the bone doesn't fuse to the rest of the bone, and therefore it looks like there's a whole bone there, but the outside of it doesn't have enough bone structure to support your body weight, and therefore that leaves it prone to avascular necrosis or the bone beginning to disintegrate. However, because Muller-Weiss is so rare, at least in my opinion, it usually takes 2 out of 3 of those conditions to actually cause it. But in Nadal's case, this has happened to him before back in the early 2000s, and he treated it with rest and basically was able to come back, and it didn't bother him again until recently. But now that it's so many years later in his 30s, and because Muller-Weiss can be a progressive disease, it might be a lot harder to treat it this time around. And what's really tricky about Muller-Weiss is it's actually pretty hard to diagnose at first because the symptoms are pretty vague. You just usually have pain in your ankle or kind of in the back part of your foot. You really need an MRI, an X-ray, and a CT scan to really get the full picture of it. And hopefully, if Nadal can go the non-surgical or conservative route, if I was his doctor, which I'm obviously not, but if I was, I'd want him 4 weeks completely off of his foot with X-rays every single week to check the structure of his foot and how it's evolving. I'd also have him on a bone stimulator, which is a device that uses acoustic waves to help stimulate bone growth. And then if he's going back into shoes, I'd really want him in a full-length carbon fiber plate under his foot and then a custom orthotic on top of that. Or if Nike can, have Nike put the carbon fiber plate actually within the substance of the shoe, and then Nadal can have another custom orthotic on top of that. The problem with that approach is because Muller-Weiss is a progressive disease, and because Nadal's game is predicated so much on his movement and how fast he can move from so far in the back of the court, and as soon as that navicular starts getting pounded like a nutcracker right in the middle of the foot, you can always get progression of that disease, which is what he's suffering from now. Because if this progresses and you actually start to get destruction of bone, right, as this thing starts to disintegrate, that's when this becomes more of a surgical problem. And the surgical options for Muller-Weiss, really none of them are great. And the reason is most surgeries involve taking out whichever is the diseased portion of the navicular bone, taking it out, putting in a bone graft, and then actually having to fuse all these bones together. Because what happens is this part of the bone just can't survive on its own, right? So it needs another bone's blood supply. The navicular is now using another bone as its lifeboat to get blood supply from. But even though athletes can get back to high levels of sport even after these types of fusions, it takes so long to make sure that these bones are starting to heal that it can get to about 6 months before you're even back on a tennis court. And the reason that it takes so long is because you're trying to revive a dead piece of tissue. You're trying to get all this blood flow from one bone and actually having to hook it up to another. But if there's one person out there that has the physical capabilities, the motivation, and frankly the resources to heal this type of injury, especially without surgery, it's got to be Nadal. But Rafa, if you're listening to this, if you do start getting pain when you come back and try to rehab this, remember, really the only way to tell if this thing is healing properly is the pain scale. If you're having pain with movement, you need to stop. If you're not, then you can keep going. This is really a common sense disease. If it hurts, stop. If it doesn't, go for it. But of course, if you have any questions or follow-up on this type of injury, make sure you leave me a comment down below. We can get the conversation started down there. And of course, if you want to see more content on the King of Clay and specifically his custom shoe gear and his custom setup, make sure you click into the video up above and subscribe down below. I'll see you in the next video.